Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in this very exciting format. I'm glad you reminded me of my past in Singapore, because I just did a presentation on Sunday morning, actually, which was quite a painful time to do a presentation. But these are online conferences these days on Singapore, addressing almost the same questions as I addressed today for the Ruhr. So, and of course, yes, this is a striking difference comparing Singapore and the Ruhr, of course, which is not my task today, but I will focus on post-industrial cities in the Ruhr today. But of course, all throughout my academic career, I worked on knowledge and innovation-based urban and regional development, and Singapore was one example, and the Ruhr, of course, since I spent the last 10 years here, sitting in front of a museum like this. This is the main question, actually. How do we transform a post-industrial city or post-industrial cities as we have in the Ruhr into knowledge-based economies? Because that is the future for the development of economies and societies alike. And of course, you're quite aware of these trajectories in post-industrial cities. Like this is the Lake Phoenix in Dortmund, which you're probably aware of. And it used to look like this in the 19th century when there was a steel mill, and then this was torn down and completely demolished. And an artificial lake was created with new office buildings and high-value residential areas, but also a technology park nearby. So it also has something to do with this knowledge-based transformation of post-industrial cities. And Shadows of the Past basically reminds us that you can't shake off your legacy. That's one of the main arguments I'm going to make. When you look at the transformation towards a knowledge-based economy in post-industrial cities, there's always something left of the past, always a shadow that's cast on today's transformation towards modern knowledge-based economic activities. So that's my overall question, basically. So what are the special challenges of post-industrial cities when they transform into knowledge-based economies? So what is the shadow of the past about? Of course, we need to address the basic question, what is a knowledge-based economy anyway? So that's, of course, a bit of some basis that we need. And of course, we will take the Ruhr as an example, but of course, I understand that you're from different unique universities. So I would like to invite you to think along and maybe do some research on your own if you're interested later on, to analyze these sort of aspects for your own region and maybe do some comparative analysis between different post-industrial cities, because I think there's still a lot to explore when it comes to the transformation of post-industrial cities into knowledge-based economies. So we will look at how the Ruhr basically performs economically and how did it transform. That's just to start with. But then we will look at the preconditions for knowledge-based economy, and that's what we call the knowledge infrastructure. That's basically universities and research organizations that produce and disseminate knowledge that can be applied for economic purposes, can be translated into jobs, into value added, into new products, into innovation. And then, of course, the key question is, how does the Ruhr perform in the knowledge-based economy? And we will see that there are very sizable problems in the Ruhr when it comes to a knowledge economy development. And how can these be overcome, these challenges, these particular challenges that stem from the past? These are the shadows of the past that lead to deficiencies in today's knowledge-based economy, even though structural change is well advanced, as you can see from examples like Lake Phoenix. So that's the outline. So the Ruhr, just a bit of an overview, but I think for the first point, you're pretty much aware of the basics. And this might also include structural change in the Ruhr, just a quick snapshot. And then we will move towards the knowledge-based economy. That's our focus. So what is that? Anyway, just a short introduction conceptually, and then we will look at the situation of the knowledge infrastructure. That's universities and research organizations in the Ruhr. But of course, the main focus was the state of the knowledge economy in the Ruhr. And then we will draw a few conclusions and answer our main questions towards the end. So, of course, you're probably pretty much familiar with the Ruhr. You know that this is the largest urban agglomeration in Germany, with its about 5 million inhabitants. But it's also a polycentric structure that consists of no less than 53 different municipalities. And it's also, of course, it's a post-industrial region. It's an agglomeration of post-industrial cities because it used to be the manufacturing heartland of Germany with a long legacy of coal mining and steel industry. So we're pretty much aware of the starting conditions. And we've witnessed many decades of structural change since the late 1950s with the first coal crisis, and then the steel crisis came in. So from 1970 onwards, employment continues to decline. The same is true for population. And if you look at more recent data like population over the past 2 decades, you see that this decline still continues for most of the time. And it only recently turned around a little bit, but this was because of massive international immigration to Germany as a whole. It was nothing particular about the Ruhr. So we see a pretty sluggish population dynamic still over many decades here in the Ruhr. Here compared to the German average and to other cities, larger cities in Germany, or the leading metropolitan regions in Germany. So these are the benchmarks for this sort of picture here. The same is true for economic performance over the past 15 years, 2000 to 2015. You see the absolute level. Of course, the Ruhr has caught up a little bit during that time when it comes to GDP per capita, but it still has some way to go to reach the levels of the leading dynamic metropolitan areas in Germany, which have much higher economic performance as measured in GDP per capita. We can look at a couple of other metrics like employment dynamics, and this is sort of a mirror of the previous slides. You will see that employment development is also less dynamic than for the nation as a whole, or for these other sets of benchmarks, where the Ruhr is usually the bottom line with the poorest dynamism, although employment on the whole, for the whole country, went up from the mid-2000s onwards because of federal labor market reforms and a generally favorable business cycle despite the crisis we had in between. So the Ruhr didn't benefit the same way from these positive trends as the country as a whole or other metropolitan regions in Germany actually did. And this, of course, led to a persistent unemployment gap, which is also a structural feature that you find in most post-industrial cities as a long-term legacy of structural change, a long shadow that's cast by structural change from manufacturing to a service-based economy. You have this difference, which is very stubborn and very stable over time, a very stable difference in employment, which is constantly higher than the national average or any of the other benchmarks you can see here. So, but you can also see, if you break this down, if you break up the Ruhr into its cities, that there are, of course, differences. You can see that average unemployment, this is the latest figures from last month, is about twice as high as for the national average. But in some cities like Gelsenkirchen, it's three times the national average. And if you would break this down even further into smaller geographical units, you find really, especially in the northern part of the region, very striking pockets of unemployment with much higher rates of unemployment, actually, which is described in the literature as cultures of unemployment that is inherited and passed on from one generation to the other. There's a persistent skills deficit that prevents this transition to the service sector in parts of the labor market. And we have a strong degree of social polarization and exclusion, which especially affect certain urban quarters in the northern part of the Ruhr. But I won't go much into breaking the Ruhr up further into smaller geographical units. I'm trying to look at basically the big picture, because I don't have unlimited time, and this is a really big topic here. But if you look at Germany as a whole, you can see that the Ruhr actually stands out when it comes to disposable household income. That's what I found a very critical indicator, because what is the amount of money actually available to households at this level? So GDP per capita is just a gross average, but how about real household income? And you can actually see that measured by disposable household income, so income that households can actually spend on consumption. Then you see that the Ruhr really stands out as a center of poverty within Western Germany, which is only reached, these low values are usually only reached in the eastern part of Germany, in the former GDR. So this is quite alarming, and I could show you some more figures how this developed over time. And it's really worrying that disposable household income in the Ruhr really fell off. And moved further away from the national average over the past 20 years, even though you would think that, okay, structural change is well advanced and think of the past. But this is really a long-lasting shadow that is still very pertinent these days, and it becomes even more distressing recently. And there has been a cluster analysis. I'm not sure if you're aware of the concept of a cluster analysis statistically, but this is basically trying to classify group regions across Germany into different types, different categories. And basically the Ruhr, more or less, forms one category on its own, because it's characterized by urban areas with persistent structural weaknesses that are still not overcome, despite all the green stuff you see in the region and all the nice Phoenix Lake type developments. And the figures still paint a really disturbing picture when you look at these issues. So that's a bit of a background. And of course, structural change, or as I call it, structural change 1.0, that's the transformation from manufacturing to services, is of course well advanced these days. So when you look at manufacturing in Germany, and this map basically shows you the share of employment that is in manufacturing. The darker the red, the higher the share of employment that's in manufacturing. You still see a very striking south-north divide. So in the southern states of Germany, which also happen to be the most affluent, the wealthiest states, you tend to find higher shares of employment in manufacturing. And you see this west-east divide as well. So you find more manufacturing in the west than in the east. But the Ruhr is no longer a manufacturing heartland. It used to be in the post-war, until the post-war area. So of course, this is also, it doesn't only have to do with the transition to, with the structural change in the Ruhr, but also because you tend to find the centers of manufacturing employment outside the larger cities. See, all larger cities, take Munich for example, are of course centers of service economy today. So they don't have high shares of manufacturing employment anyway, because think about manufacturing activity that uses a lot of space, and space is limited in cities. So manufacturing tends to be rather suburbanized or de-urbanized. So you find the highest shares of manufacturing employment outside the large agglomeration. So in some sense, the deindustrialization of the Ruhr is also a process of normalization, basically, of moving towards an urban service economy. But still, you can see that manufacturing share in gross value added, so we just saw the employment share, this is the share in output. So the share in value added really is below the average in the Ruhr, so below the German average. And below the North Rhine-Westphalian state average. But remember that modern urban economies are service economies by and large. So this is why it's little wonder that this is a process of normalization. If you compare the Ruhr against the other metropolitan areas in Germany, you still see that manufacturing was still a bit higher until about 10 years ago, and then this completely normalized. So the low share we find these days in the Ruhr of manufacturing and value added is pretty much a normal feature of urban agglomerations in Germany. And you can also basically take a closer look at the key industries and the key activities. And this is not the most recent data I can offer you, but I very much like this kind of chart, which is of course a bit complicated, but if you spend a moment thinking about it, what we see here is basically on the vertical axis, the so-called location quotient. That's the share of employment measured against the national average. So if you have a location quotient of 2, this means your employment share in this industry is twice the national average. And you will see that some activities like coal mining and oil refining, of course, as we speak, there's no coal mining left, but we still have oil refining in the region. This would be 5.5 times the national average, the employment share. So this is a very strong specialization. So you see specialization or lack of specialization on the vertical axis, and horizontally you see employment growth over time during this period. And you see that the activities that are increasing are largely service activities over here, whereas manufacturing activities still continue to decline. And this reminds us that this shift from manufacturing to services is still going on, even as we speak. This is still a constant process. Structural change from manufacturing to services is still not completed yet. It's an ongoing process, although the share of manufacturing employment is still pretty low in the region as a whole. So just some preliminary conclusions before we move into the knowledge economy, which is of course the main focus today, that deindustrialization and the shift towards the service economy, what we call tertiarization for services as the tertiary sector of the economy, is well advanced in the Ruhr. So we have below average presence of manufacturing, which you may see as a normal feature for urban economies in Germany, but it can also be seen as a weakness because nowadays manufacturing is quite important. You tend to see that countries, but also regions with a strong share of manufacturing are very resilient over time in times of crisis, like in the financial crisis of the 2008, 2009. And also there are increasing linkages between manufacturing and services, so especially business services. Modern parts of the service economy, high value added parts of the service economy are closely linked to manufacturing activities. So they're often linked in hybrid value chains where firms produce a manufactured product like some machinery, but that requires a lot of service basically to perform its functions. So there's this distinction between manufacturing and service is somehow artificial and doesn't really hold these days. There are increasingly interlinkages between manufacturing and services. So having a poor manufacturing base is not necessarily a sign of strength for today, for modern economies. And of course, we see legacies of structural change, and I didn't really mention all of those. So there used to be, of course, nothing but coal and steel in the past, but now we have a lot of fragmentation of different industries and technologies in different parts of the Ruhr. I didn't go enough into detail to really show you that. We see a constant backwardness in value added and labor productivity and persistently high unemployment as shadows of the past. And also a persistent income gap, and I particularly find this falling off of disposable household income over the past 2 decades particularly troublesome. So we see that there are quite some scars left from structural change in the Ruhr before we look at the knowledge-based economy. So how does the Ruhr perform there? First of all, we need to establish what we mean by a knowledge-based economy. So knowledge-based economy can be defined in very simple fashion as economies that are directly based on the production, distribution, and use of knowledge. So this is a little surprising because even historically, you can't imagine an economy that works without knowledge, right? But this term knowledge-based economy denotes the increasing reliance of knowledge as both an input to production, but also as an output, as a product. And this contains, of course, different dimensions. So a knowledge economy is about the creation of knowledge, about research and development to systematically find new knowledge, develop new products. But also applying this new knowledge, producing new ideas and putting them to use, economic use in terms of jobs and value added being generated from new products and processes. But also it's about acquiring knowledge that is available elsewhere. So you can acquire knowledge and then diffuse it in your region. And that's the strategy of using ideas for economic development or for societal development, more broadly speaking. But so these are basically the two general ways of developing knowledge economies, is by producing ideas and putting them to economic use, and by acquiring ideas from elsewhere. And this is something that Singapore is always good at by basically sourcing knowledge worldwide and then applying it locally, diffusing it in the local economy. That's the other strategy here. So if you want to measure the knowledge economy, that becomes a bit difficult, but we will try to keep it simple. What do we have to know about measuring the knowledge economy? So when you look at manufacturing, right, we can basically somehow very in a crude way split manufacturing in 2 parts, the knowledge intensive part and the not so knowledge intensive part. This is very arbitrary, of course. So you see some thresholds here, and the key indicator is research and development. So whenever there's an industry that has a high share of its turnover invested in research and development, we assume that this is very knowledge intensive because these guys spend a lot on research and development to develop new knowledge for their products and services. So we have this distinction: if an industry spends more than 9% of its turnover on research and development, then there's cutting edge technology. If that's between 3 and 9%, that's high technology, and that's basically this middle band, which where the German industry is very much specialized on. And then, of course, there's also the service economy, which can be split into the knowledge-intensive part, so that's knowledge-based services, and the other part, which is not knowledge-intensive, it uses less knowledge. But for that, R&D, research and development, is not a proper metric, because these small service companies usually don't perform any formal research and development. So here for the service sector, we usually take the share of employees that have university degrees, so that's what we call human capital in economic terms. So university graduates as a share of employment, but also the share of natural scientists and engineers as metrics at the industry level to distinguish the knowledge-intensive services from the rest of the service economy. And if we apply these definitions, we can see that across the board in modern, highly developed economies, the share of these knowledge-based activities in the economic output of each country is increasing over time. And you can also see differences in the patterns. For instance, Germany has a striking strength in this high technology sector between 3 and 9%, but not really in cutting edge technology with more than 9% of R&D intensity. And you see that some service economies like the UK, some knowledge economies like the UK, are mostly driven by the service sector, because the UK hardly has any manufacturing left, which is a very different economic model to Germany. Now, when we look at the Ruhr, we will look at different dimensions. We will look next at universities and research organizations as the knowledge infrastructure. That's not formally part of the knowledge economy, but this lays the foundation. Right? It produces the knowledge, generates knowledge, distributes knowledge that can be used by the knowledge economy. And then we will look at innovation potential, that's R&D and patents. So research and development is basically the investment into new knowledge generation, and patents can be the output of this research. So that's basically protected knowledge, but it's not really commercially used yet. So a patent doesn't mean it's economically relevant, but it's protected new knowledge. So that's the best we can measure. And then we will look at human capital, of course, as a key driver of economic growth. And in the right column, you see a lot of theories and references if you want to delve into the details and the theoretical underpinnings of these aspects. Then, of course, there's entrepreneurship. We will look at that. So that's a key way of commercializing new knowledge, translating knowledge, research output into new products through setting up a new firm to introduce new knowledge to the market. And then, of course, we will also look at the cultural and creative economy as a particular class of knowledge-based activities. So let's start with the knowledge infrastructure in the Ruhr. You may be aware that the Ruhr praises itself as being the densest university landscape across Europe. No idea if that's true, but it just means that we have many universities in the Ruhr and even more university locations, because especially the smaller universities of applied sciences are scattered across different locations. So basically, following the polycentric nature of this city landscape, we see basically a scattered distribution of different universities, full universities like ours, or universities of applied sciences, which are younger and smaller. And you can also see a difference for those of you who are already aware of the south-north divide in the Ruhr. It's also striking to note that you find basically the main universities, the red dots, they're all in the southern part of the Ruhr, whereas the smaller, the younger universities of applied sciences, they are somehow scattered in the north, but in the northern part, you don't see that many university locations anyway. So basically, this reinforces the south-north divide that historically emerged in the Ruhr, but this is something for more detailed discussion, so I just want to point to this issue. We see that this university infrastructure is relatively young. It only emerged basically after the first signs of structural change started in the late 1950s. Then the first universities were set up, including, of course, the largest and oldest one here in Bochum, but the other universities followed. And then more recently, there was a wave of new universities of applied sciences being set up, mainly in the northern part of the region. And within these universities, of course, we have like 200,000 students. That's a large number. even if you don't count the distance learning university in Hagen, because these students are not really physically in the region. But leaving those aside, you can see that basically the student numbers also increased dramatically, even recently in the previous decade. So that's a good sign, of course. Yes, we get more students into the universities. But at the same time, staff numbers and professor numbers didn't increase at the same pace. So actually the result is that the student-professor ratios are also increasing. And you can look at all levels. You can compare North Rhine-Westphalia against the other 15 German federal states. Then North Rhine-Westphalia will have the highest student-professor ratio. That means the largest number of students that each professor, like Professor Pries or myself, has to cater for. So basically, this is a sign of pretty weak endowment, or put it other way, high productivity of professors. But of course, it means that other federal states have basically better endowment for the universities. And the Ruhr also has one of the poorest endowments when measured by a student-professor ratio. So the logic is, if you have basically fewer students per professor or more professor per students, then of course the quality of education will be better and you will have more time for research and stuff like that. So that's the issue behind that. We also have some data, although this is quite old and not really perfect, but we have some evidence and to really support the point that we produce a large number of graduates each year out of this population of 200,000 students. But a sizable portion of these students doesn't remain in the region after graduation. So they tend to go elsewhere, especially to the southern parts of Germany or the more dynamic metropolitan areas like Hamburg, Frankfurt, or Berlin. So basically, this is the balance we're drawing here. So we have 4 groups of students. We have the students who basically who came from this region and stayed in the region after graduation. They're quite neutral. The same is true for those who are transiting. So they came here for studying and they leave the region after graduation. But the interesting thing is the balance between the other two. So the students who came from this region studied at our universities but left the region after graduation. This was 25% of this cohort. Whereas the other way around, those who came to the region and stayed after graduation were only 13%. So the difference between two is what we call the brain flow balance, and that's negative, and that's what we call a brain drain. So basically, we tend to produce more students than the regional economy can actually absorb, the regional labor market can absorb. So this leads students to move out to other parts of Germany mostly. So we actually produce an oversupply of graduates for the rest of the country, put it short. So that's basically the pattern here. So we have this sizable university infrastructure, knowledge infrastructure that has been set up, but this graduate output cannot be fully absorbed by the local economy. And this is already a sign of weakness for the local knowledge economy. If we had a well-functioning local regional knowledge economy, this should be able to absorb the graduates that we produce. And this is actually, this is true for all the other metropolitan areas in Germany, the metropolitan regions. They don't suffer from this brain drain. They have a brain gain in reverse. So this is a unique feature here for our post-industrial region. So as a consequence of that, we tend to find pretty low shares of graduates in the workforce in the Ruhr, despite the fact that we have the densest university landscape in Europe, and we have at least 200,000 students in the region. But still, the share of university graduates in employment is strikingly low. It's only somewhere around the national average, as you can see here for the four major Ruhr cities, which are marked in blue. Whereas some other cities, just neighboring cities like Cologne and Düsseldorf in the Rhineland, just outside the Ruhr, have much higher shares. And of course, this is no comparison to high-tech cities like Munich, which basically attract graduates from all around the country, right? Or places like Erlangen, where firms like Siemens are headquartered with some facilities which are very have a very strong knowledge economy. So they attract graduates from all across the country. Whereas the Ruhr produces a lot of graduates, but only has a very modest share of graduates in employment, which is unusual for metropolitan areas with strong universities. So this is a sign of, another sign of brain drain and poor absorption of graduates by the local economy. So just as a kind of another summary for the science base or for the knowledge infrastructure. Yes, we have a huge pool of talent with our students. We have a large chunk of professors, although not as much as we would need to get an average student-professor ratio. We also have a sizable economic impact that you can measure by the universities themselves. So universities are a major provider of employment, and they also generate a lot of demand for goods and services in the region. But on the other hand, we have a rather poor endowment at our universities, which is evident from the highest student-professor ratio. So we would need in the Ruhr alone about 400 or 20% more professors to reach the national average in student-professor ratios. That is, I think, is also linked to pretty low levels of third-party funding per professor as a measure for research excellence these days. We also have outside the universities rather few non-university research institutes. Some of you may have heard about the famous Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany or Max Planck Institutes, especially the Fraunhofer Institutes, who work closely with industry to transfer knowledge to industry. Many other regions, other metropolitan regions, have a much higher number of these institutes than the Ruhr. So over time, not enough political effort was put into attracting these facilities to the region. And this is improving right now, but it takes a long time to set up these facilities. And of course, other regions have a much better start there. And also we have a gap in science-based entrepreneurship when it comes to spin-offs or entrepreneurship in general. So let's take the last few minutes to look at the knowledge economy itself in the Ruhr. So we already have gained some hints, but there's a few more metrics, like the share of employees in knowledge-based manufacturing. So that is basically the knowledge-based part of the manufacturing sector as defined earlier on. And you can see that the Ruhr is pretty light in color here and pretty low down the ranks compared to other cities. Of course, cities are no longer hotbeds of manufacturing, right? So we established that, so we should keep that in mind. But still, other cities tend to have higher shares of knowledge-based manufacturing still. We also, behind that, there's research and development. So research and development is very much below average in the Ruhr, in the business sector. So that's not the universities doing research. So that is research done in firms. And you see that we are lacking research-intensive companies, right? We have a lot of universities, but this is not matched by research-intensive firms in the region that can then also absorb the many graduates that we produce. So this is all connected, as you see, it goes hand in hand. So we have pretty low research and development expenditure in the Ruhr, which also drags the North Rhine-Westphalian average down. And the same is true for R&D personnel. Of course, spending and personnel are also pretty tightly connected. And as a result of that, if you don't invest much in research and development, you don't produce much new knowledge, which is then measured by patents. So you see that so-called patent density, so patents normalized against employment, is also shows the same picture. Basically, it's the same backwardness of the Ruhr compared to West Germany or Germany as a whole. So these are signs of weakness across the value chain in the knowledge economy, if you like. You can also look at knowledge-intensive services. We just looked at knowledge-intensive manufacturing, but for knowledge-intensive services as well, you see across the board that this is increasing over time. That's a good sign that we're shifting towards more knowledge-based activities across the board. But still, there's this persistent deficit in the Ruhr, which is, of course, roughly in line with the national average. But if you consider that knowledge-based services are concentrated heavily in urban agglomerations, and you see that the larger cities as a whole, but also the top metropolitan regions have much higher shares of knowledge-intensive services than the Ruhr, then you see that also in this part of the knowledge economy, the Ruhr shows distinct weaknesses still. The same is true for net new firm formation, so entrepreneurship by and large. So that's the number of new firms being registered in a year minus firm closures. So that's the balance. You see that the Ruhr shows very little dynamism when it comes to firm population. And there are, of course, alternative metrics for entrepreneurship as well. No matter what figures you look at for entrepreneurship, the Ruhr performs really badly. And this is our long-term legacy of post-industrial cities that over time, there's a lack of role models, a lack of entrepreneurial culture. Your dad, your grandparents used to work for large industrial conglomerates in coal mining and steel industry. So you don't have many role models to look at and to think and to develop a spirit for setting up your own firm sooner or later. I know that there are a lot of counterexamples these days, and this is a good sign. There are a lot of activities and networks being set up to support entrepreneurship, but still the figures are quite stubborn and show this lack that we still have in the world when it comes to entrepreneurship. This is a long-lasting shadow of the past. The same is true for university-based entrepreneurship. So we see this so-called EXIST as a federal government program to support academic entrepreneurship from the university spin-offs. And we see the number of grants in absolute numbers. The Ruhr is by far trailing the leading hotspots like Berlin and Munich, despite the fact that the Ruhr is the largest metropolitan region and it has this very dense and massive university landscape. So this is a pretty low figure when it comes to university-based entrepreneurship as well. And now finally, the colorful and fun part of the knowledge economy is, of course, the cultural and creative economy. So look at all these beautiful, colorful people doing creative stuff and various activities of the so-called cultural and creative economy. And this is a sizable part of the German economy with about 4% of employment and 3% of GDP, but also quite heterogeneously spread across these 11 different sub-markets plus some others. So how is this distributed? The cultural and creative economy as a shiny and sexy part of the knowledge economy is highly unevenly spread across Germany. So it's highly concentrated in the larger cities because culture and creativity is an urban phenomenon, isn't it? So you would expect the Ruhr to also perform well in these activities, but the opposite is true. The Ruhr cities, once again, are picked the 4 largest and are just clumped around the German average. And the German average also includes all these rural areas where you would hardly find any creative people, any people in the creative economy, right? So you have to compare that to places like Düsseldorf and Cologne. These are, once again, our neighboring cities in the Rhineland, just next door, and they have much higher shares of cultural and creative economy. And this is still a far cry from hotspots like Munich, once again. And Gifhorn is a bit of an odd place where all the software developers for Volkswagen are clustered. So that's a bit of an odd case. But you see that the Ruhr still has a sizable lack in creative industry employment by and large. But nevertheless, there are strong hopes being based on the creative economy in post-industrial cities. And this is true for all around the world, basically. In all post-industrial cities, the cultural and creative economy are seen as a vehicle for transformation. The same is true for the Ruhr. Of course, we had the European Capital of Culture in 2010, and this was seen as a main event to also have a long-lasting boosting effect on the creative and knowledge economy. This was seen as a white hope for basically to fill vacant property, because in post-industrial cities you have many vacancies and derelict buildings. So let's fill them with interim users, with artists, and we have many of these buildings being filled with artists in the Ruhr. But these don't produce any employment or value added. These are just artists basically working for themselves. So they don't really produce a large economic impact here. So we see that still we have significantly lower shares in employment, turnover and value added in the Ruhr compared to neighboring cities and other metropolitan regions in Germany. There are of course some notable exceptions, like some market niches, like the games development in Essen or Mülheim and the Ruhr. These are some cities which have some small clustering of these knowledge, these creative activities there. But for the region as a whole, this is of course only a very small development. And we have some challenges, of course, that have been singled out by an early report that might hold back the development of the cultural and creative economy in the Ruhr. But of course, we have some flagship developments, and this is also a usual approach to develop the cultural and creative economy. Let's come up with a flagship project to boost the creative and cultural economy. Like we had this former brewery building, the Dortmunder U. You may have heard about this, or of course our world cultural heritage, the Zollverein in Essen, which were basically heavily subsidized and transformed as future hopes for the or sites for the knowledge, for the cultural and creative economy. But Of course, some of you may be from Bilbao. This is the UNIC network. So of course, you're all aware of the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, and that's the so-called Bilbao effect that everybody all around the world, post-industrial cities are hoping for the Bilbao effect. We just set up a museum or some other cultural flagship, and then the creative economy will start to flock in and cluster around that. Of course, it worked in Bilbao, but not in many other places. So in Dortmund, we still don't see sizable effects, and the same is true for Zollverein, but we're still trying. But at the same time, cultural and creative activities are popping up spontaneously in some smaller places, in the shadow of these flagships. So like in some well-integrated and rather cheap and central locations, rather than on a site like Zollverein, which is a bit like far away from the city center, a bit monofunctional. And it's not really urban in the sense of the word, because it's just too far away from the city center. So there are differences. There are some very nice bottom-up initiatives, and there are these politically driven top-down flagships that you see here. And there seems to be a bit of a mismatch between these two. Okay, I'm well above my time limit, if there's any, so just let me get to some final conclusions and thoughts. Just to sum up, we looked at the knowledge infrastructure in the Ruhr, and we see, yes, there's huge potential in these large number of universities and the massive student population. And also we have some well-established instruments for technology transfer, like incubators and technology parks, and I didn't go into the details there. But on the other hand, we have a rather poor endowment funding of these universities. We have relatively few public research organizations of the Max Planck and Fraunhofer type. And we have rather weak research base when it's measured by third-party research funding, because the universities are more or less bottled up with education and high student load. So that's also part of the history of the universities, because they were set up to provide tertiary education in a region that was previously unserved. When it comes to the knowledge economy, we see that the creative economy may be thriving bottom up in some small niches and places. But on the other hand, we have still a very sizable lack of innovation capacity in the business sector. We have a few large firms performing research and development. That also means there's pretty limited demand for university graduates. That adds to the brain drain that we had, that our graduates tend to leave to other metropolitan regions in the country. There's still a lack of entrepreneurship across the board, but there are signs that this might be changing, but it doesn't show in the figures yet. And also the creative economy and cultural economy is still lagging behind quite a bit quantitatively. And this is very much a striking contrast to the political hopes that are placed on these activities for at least a decade already. So some general changes, I'm trying to separate this now. So what are some general features, I think, for post-industrial cities trying to develop a knowledge economy? I think it's quite common for post-industrial cities to start with a lack of innovative large firms, because they just didn't have any room to develop under the old industrial regime. And also low absorptive capacity for knowledge that comes from the universities, a weak creative and cultural sector, and also a lack of entrepreneurial culture, because these are some of the long-lasting shadows cast by this industrial heritage. So that's what I call path dependence, which is quite typical for post-industrial cities. On the other hand, you see some specifics for the Ruhr, for instance, the polycentric nature, strong heterogeneity and south-north divide, fragmentation, which I really only pointed to, but not really went into detail. But also this polycentric structure puts up a lot of challenges to political governance. There's a lot of fighting between the cities, lack of unity, but also it's difficult to market such an entity compared to more monocentrically structured cities. And of course, we have a lack of university funding and public research organizations, which is not necessarily true for, it's not a typical feature of for post-industrial cities. So what should we do about this? Here you see a politician seeking advice, basically by talking to himself. That's what politicians like to do. So basically, it's more complicated. So politicians commission consultants, and they basically tell them what they want to hear. So that's what this picture is about. But what should be done? Of course, you need to strengthen the knowledge infrastructure, because this is where knowledge is generated and disseminated. That's the engine of a knowledge-based economy. So you need to better endow your universities, and this, you might call me selfish because I'm working at one of those, but this is sad but true. And of course, we need to expand our research base in public research organizations. This is happening, it started to happen, but there's a long way to go, and it takes a lot of time to set up this infrastructure. So then we need to develop technology transfer, and there's some nice new concepts that need to really hit the road. Also adapting older concepts like incubators and technology parks that have been around for 35 years now. We need to strengthen the regional knowledge-based economy by attracting knowledge-based firms. This is difficult, but it seems to work because the universities these days and their graduates, they attract some firms from outside, and it happened in Bochum, so it worked. But of course, we need to build and improve an entrepreneurial climate, culture, and ecosystem, and this really is something that takes a long time, because this helps us to overcome this long shadow that's cast by a structural change in the past. And of course, by attracting new knowledge-based firms and by growing our own firms in the region, promoting role models for entrepreneurship, we can then improve also the absorptive capacity for graduates and lessen the brain drain that we're suffering from right now. So that provides more opportunities for our own graduates to really find employment and to found their own firms here. And of course, you can get involved by doing research on this. Go and study your own region, compare to the Ruhr, do some stuff, get some research done on channels of knowledge and technology transfer. For instance, there's a lot to be explored. You can look at regional knowledge networks or knowledge-based urban and regional development. And I didn't go into details here, but the university cities develop master plans how to connect their knowledge infrastructure to urban development, like Bochum, Dortmund, but also the university quarter in Essen. These are nice case studies you can study in your thesis, for instance, do some comparative stuff with your home city. We need definitely more comparative research, including regions facing similar challenges, and who else could do this better than the UNIC network? So get involved, do something about it. You can all leave a mark on this. So please, thanks for your time. Hope you enjoyed this a little bit as I did, and I'm really happy, look forward to some questions and comments. Thank you.